Right. So, today's agenda, we've heard from Avril with some welcome remarks. We're going to introduce the land use plan to you today so that you get a common understanding of where we are and what we're doing. But the majority of today is going to be spent around hearing from you. And the way that we'll do that today is we'll break out into breakout sessions around the topics that you see on the screen. And then at the end, we'll come back together to hear about what y'all talked about and some opportunities for the site. Our next slide. I think a lot of you are familiar with the project, but if you're not, the way we started with this project, we start with a vision, and that's on the screen. And, I won't read it to you, but what I want you to take away from this is the vision for the site is to provide community benefit. And we see that in a lot of different ways. We see that with affordable housing. We see that with workforce housing. We see that with public recreation opportunities. But we also see this through the lens of sustainability. And so a key part of our vision and how we proceeded was beginning with an environmental assessment of the property to make sure whatever we do on the property, even if for good benefit, will still be done in a sustainable way. On our next slide, we've identified some more specific goals. And, some of the goals that I'll sort of mention here, that bottom left corner, inclusive and affordable housing. And so the vision for this project is to be a mixed income development so that we have affordability at multiple levels. Additionally, if we just kind of stay on the bottom, let's conserve as much of the site as possible. It's a beautiful site, but it does have steep slopes. There are wetlands, and even in the interest of affordable housing, it may not be worth it to sort of damage those conserved areas. On our next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how we'll measure our success. And so a lot of content here, but know that as we proceed, those goals that we've identified on the prior slides, we'll be measuring against those. You can skip forward, Kim. That's good. Thank you. But one of my favorite things to do as we talk about this site is to talk about where it is and why it's important. And so on the current picture, you can kind of see the Ferry Road site called out. There's a sort of pinkish outline around it. And what we've done here is we've shown you kind of how this site could be complementary to a lot of the new, but also the existing things that are going on in this area. And so in the bottom right corner, you see the Future Employment and Training Center. This is the future home of Pratt & Whitney at Biltmore Park West, but additionally the future home of the AB Tech Workforce Training Center. You can also see at the bottom of the screen, the Bent Creek River Park. This is one of our most accessed parks in the Buncombe County system. Lots of folks view this as a great place for recreation and a great way to get into the river. We're also near the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Arboretum. These are existing assets that are already in place. And so what we see with Ferry Road is the opportunity to bring affordable housing, additional recreation opportunities, but also active transportation. So you can see the dotted line, that sort of depicts a potential greenway that would lead from the Ferry Road site to the future bridge across the French Broad River that will lead us into Biltmore Park West and the AB Tech Workforce Training Center. So as you see this concept map, there's a lot of work to be done, but I hope you see the connectivity and the potential of linking folks with housing to multimodal transportation, recreation opportunities for the public, and future employment and workforce training center hubs. So with that said, that's kind of the concept. I'd like to turn it back over to Kim, who's going to walk us through some of the details of the natural resource assessment, but also Bob Beagle, who will walk us through some of the scenarios that have been developed thus far.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Kim Williams, and I'm a planner with Equinox. We're a landscape architecture planning and design firm out of Asheville. And we've worked with a whole consultant team, wood engineering, Lord Act Sargent, who's Bob, who will speak for a second, is with, and traffic planning and design. And we're tasked to lead the Ferry Road land use plan. And an essential part of kicking this plan off was doing early analysis to make sure that this plan was both sustainable and buildable. So We're going to share some scenarios with you in a bit with Bob, but we want to also show you the process to get to these scenarios. So the first thing we did is look at a natural resource analysis of what is the important natural resources on the site. And there's several layers that we looked at through GIS analysis, but also with our ecologists in the field. And those are floodplain, floodway, existing water courses, wet areas like seeps and wetlands, unique natural communities, steep slopes, and a statewide ranking layer for biodiversity. We ranked those different layers based on how important they are and kind of layer caked them together. And resulting is the map on the right, which shows in the darkest green, the highest critical zones, a primary conservation zone, which is a lighter green, and then the tan is a secondary. I'll share with you in a second that all of these different zones have implications for whether or not, you know, they're worth impacting or if they should really be minimized of any kind of impact. The critical zone is existing water courses and wetlands buffered by 30 feet, as well as riparian natural communities. There is a swamp forest bog complex down by the river that is a critical part of the habitat, as well as some cliff areas that are good for natural habitat. The primary zone is that lighter green. That's the floodway, existing water courses buffered even further and steep slopes. And we recommend that these areas are development impact is limited. And then in the tan area, the secondary zone is, there may be impact there, but low impact development and sustainable development is really critical there. And those are the layers that make that up. So what we did is took this environmental layer and then layered it in with both transportation analysis as well as development suitability analysis. So traffic planning and design helped us with the transportation part. And we looked at 3 different options for connecting to the site. One would be connecting in at the Bent Creek Ranch Road. That's the main road to get up into the Bent Creek area and is signalized. So that's option A. Option B would be a one-way option converting Dry Ferry Road into one-way. And then option C is a new ferry road access that would get you more directly into the site. We have talked to both landowners and NCDOT in early conversations about these, some key stakeholder landowners. So these conversations will continue as well as further analysis as we move through the plan. Once we looked at environmentally sensitive areas, we also looked at proximity utilities and transportation and other adverse conditions like the noise from I-26 and came up with a suitability map. So the area in tan is the areas where development suitability is the best. And so we're looking at about 46 acres of that. And then another about 65 acres where conservation or low impact development is really critical. So before I turn it over to Bob to talk about the scenarios, these are 5 different scenarios of which from a lower to a higher density of different types of land use that could occur on site. And we want to get your feedback on that. I'm going to talk about what it means to be a sustainable development. These are some of the aspects that we want to make sure are integrated. And we also want your feedback on for how we can make this site the most sustainable we can. So from here, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Thanks, Kim. My name is Bob Beagle. I'm a architect and urban planner with a firm called Lordak Sargent in Atlanta, which is a little bit of a mouthful, so you can just call us LAS, like everybody else does. I'm super excited to be here. This is a really cool project. So many interesting things could happen here, and I'm really tickled to just with the sort of framework that we've been working under and that everybody sort of bought into of sort of low impact development, conservation focus, sustainability. You know, sometimes in our work with private developers, we don't get to do all that stuff. And so I think this is a really good opportunity for the county to be very proactive. So a little bit of, before I go into these 5 scenarios, just a little bit of overview on the overall intent and sort of some of the common features. So it'll be very self-evident when you see these. They're very sketchy and very loose. We have 5 options. That's very much by design. This isn't intended to say we have all the answers and here's these 5 concepts that are very precise. They're very high level and rough. We also don't think necessarily any one of these are the answer per se. There could be some pushing and pulling between them. There could be some crossover things. This is just a way to explore some different directions and trade-off uses and intensity. But ultimately where this project will head in the next phase is really starting to narrow down a little bit and start to push some of these together, and sort of some of the things we have on the edges might fall away. So the metaphorical edges, not the edges of the site. A couple common design features you'll see when we get into this. Housing is very important. Affordable housing is very important. You heard Tim mention mixed income housing. So every scheme has some level of housing, but they differ drastically in how much. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The natural environment is very important. So every concept incorporates some pretty significant conservation, open space, trails, focus on nature and recreation with public access to those things. So it's not just about the development having access, it's about some level of regional access as well. And you saw Tim highlight that notion of a regional greenway trail really connecting through the site. So that's a way to connect this beyond. In that same vein, we thought it was pretty important, and I think our team thought it was important, and the county sure thought it was important, that we didn't overly push the site around, meaning we didn't sort of beat it into submission with these concepts and do a whole lot of mass clearing and mass grading and some of those things. So you'll see here, we've taken those overlays that Kim and her team has developed of sort of those development areas and tried to work generally within those. They vary from concept to concept. It varies a little bit in terms of how tight we keep the development versus how expanding it and doing a little bit wider, you'll see. But they all try to have that mindset of being sensitive to the land. So what you'll see when we get into this is that leads to a sort of a strange looking amoeba sketches where you have these fingers that go out onto these promontories in the site rather than sort of big urban grid kind of feel, which I think is very appropriate. And then finally, you know, we all know, and we have a transportation planner on our team, Christy, who I don't think is here today, but Kim and sort of hit on it. Transportation access is going to be difficult in this site. So all of these concepts are trying to be thoughtful and mindful of different ways you can get in and out of the site, depending on the intensity. And again, those may not be mutually exclusive. So with that, let's run quickly through these 5 schemes. I think we still have a good amount of time, so I think we're in good shape. And as Kim mentioned, they sort of generally go from less intense to more intense. And again, these aren't the answers, these are just ways to explore differences. So this first concept is really one that takes the notion of focusing on that nature and recreational aspect. It's really about a regional destination that the general public can come and explore and use, that has a little bit of housing, but not a lot of housing. This one has the least amount of housing of all the schemes, so therefore the least ability to support affordable housing, but does create a lot of open space and preservation, conservation, and creates a little bit of sort of what we would call recreational based economy. So light industry, flex industry, whatever you want to call it, specialized sort of economic development that's really geared around that recreational component. So if you want to flip to the next one. So for each of these concepts, we've sort of thrown in some pictures. Again, not meant to be the answer, just meant to convey a little bit of that character and feel for each of these concepts. We think it's, you know, sometimes it's hard to look at a sketch plan from 10,000 feet up in the air and sort of get a feel for it. So these are just some of the pictures. And again, this is sort of the lower density, least intense feel. So you'll see some emphasis on some of the open spaces. So here's a diagram. We're looking down on the site. Little bit of caution there. The way these are cropped, the site is real weird. If you remember from that aerial that Tim was presenting earlier with the greenway cutting through, there's a thin little finger that takes us down to the south to the new bridge connection over to Biltmore Park West. And just for the sake of this, there's no development obviously that can fit in that, but they all have a potential trail connection through there. So just kind of assume, even though it kind of goes off screen there, that you see that. A little bit of word on the legend here. So the dark solid green line is that potential greenway trail that would go through the site. It's in generally the same location in every concept, just based on the topography and the terrain and the easiest way to get it across. The dashed green lines, the dashed dark green lines, are intended to convey some level of a sort of local trail system. And those are generally worked through with topography, but they're very loose and conceptual. So the exact alignment obviously would vary. And then the colors are basically land use colors. So the sort of golden yellow there is single family. And when we say single family, I think we're probably talking about small lot single family, could have accessory units, some of those kind of things. Small homes, things, where we're not talking about estate lots and McMansions and some of those kind of things. The orange color is what we call missing middle. So I think a lot of you probably know what missing middle is. That's pretty becoming very common in our lexicon these days, but those are things like they're in the next scale up. So townhomes, duplex, quads, 10 unit apartment buildings, small scale, but they are a little more dense than single family. It's a piece that's generally missing in our market, throughout the country. It's just a place that could provide some ability to get some affordability at a lower scale that we're just don't see as much of as we'd like to across the country. So that's why it's called the missing middle, because it's in the middle and it generally isn't very prevalent. The brown color is multifamily. So you can think of that like apartments, walk-up apartments, garden style apartments, could be a little more dense than that if needed. The dark purple and the light purple aren't in this scheme. You'll see that later. But those are sort of that flex, just specialized flex industrial, light industrial, for lack of a better term. That's sort of job creation, industry oriented. The dark red, which again, we don't, and the dark red with the hash, we don't have in this scheme, but that's sort of straight up retail, commercial, or vertical mixed use. The pink, which we do have in this scheme, is sort of that recreation based industry, whatever that might be. And of course, obviously green is open space. And the blue stars are, for lack of a better term, points of interest. So we think there's some really interesting spots on this site. We did a walking tour, a whole day walking tour back in, I guess it was, that was in April, I think. So it's been a while. And I think we were really struck with, there were a few places. I mentioned these fingers that sort of are promontories that come out, and you get some incredible views up and down the river and across the river. And so there's some really points to celebrate there. So that's a little bit of backdrop on how to read these as I go through them. So first concept, the first thing to notice, and I don't know, Kim, if you have a cursor, maybe you can just follow along and point to things. So I'm just going to kind of go through some things that should be self-evident. But in this one, we're really looking at this has a somewhat of a regional access aspect to it because of this recreation-based focus and the notion that this is bringing destination-oriented people in from outside. So this one actually works through that concept, that access concept that comes through the adjacent property. So the sort of primary access would come from the southwest rather than focusing too heavily on Ferry Road. We're a little concerned about Ferry Road. It's not a big, heavy road. So while we're making connections to it, we're not creating primary entries. So that you see the entry is sort of on the south, in the southwest, two points, and the other one a little bit farther over to the right there that could cut through the adjacent property. Yeah, there you go. Secondly, those pink pads, those are what I mentioned as that sort of recreational focus. So that's an opportunity for some job creation. I mentioned those fingers. In this case, we're using the two yellow fingers as really a very narrow single family small lot. So those are little neighborhoods, very small unit count, a little bit of open space, and then sort of a neighborhood park at the end of those promontories to really celebrate that, and a little bit of missing middle in the middle. So it's kind of like a neighborhood on one side and the recreation employment on the other side, and then on the north side is an apartment development. So we're trying to get in some housing here, but not a ton. So this actually is not the lowest housing scheme, but it's one of the lowest. This gets about 300 maybe units, 300 to 400 units, something like that, depending on how dense you build those apartments. So that's concept A. Let's go to the next one. And we can come back when we're all done here, we can come back and answer any questions if we need to, or however Kim wants to do it. So concept B is really less of that focus on regional destination and a little bit more like creating a neighborhood, a smaller, lower density, lower impact neighborhood. So we call this the traditional lower density community center. So we're creating a neighborhood, but less of that regional destination focus. So it has a a little bit more housing, as very similar to the previous scheme, but you'll see it uses more land for housing, but doesn't do the sort of big apartment development to get there on your unit count. It gets there through lower density things. So go ahead and go to the next one. So some samples of kind of how that could look. So as an example, that picture on the lower left is sort of a little bit of that missing middle kind of notion, where it's still lower density, but has a little bit of ability to get some more than 1 unit per building. Relatively small scale, small lot, single family, real opportunity to work with the land. The upside of the single family is it's compared to apartments, of course, is you can't get maybe as much density, but you can probably be a little more sensitive in terms of low impact development. You don't have to grade the land. You don't have to clear as many trees. You have a lot more ability to work around the natural environment. Go to the next one. So, and I'm sorry, this one also starts with the notion of you're creating a little bit of a neighborhood. We think we might be able to get in a little bit of a retail commercial feel here, very local serving, very small quantity, not a big town center kind of feel, but just a little bit of commercial that kind of could support the neighborhood around it. You can go to the next one. So here we're, again, you see there's none of that brown color, so we don't have any apartments. This one is almost exclusively residential, and it's pretty exclusively that smaller scale stuff. So a lot of that small lot single family, a lot of that missing middle built in. One thing of note here, because we've added a little bit more of that commercial, that red in the middle sort of is a little bit of like a mini little town center, and we got a little community green. It's actually not that little, it looks little on this drawing, but remember, this is a really big site. So you have a little bit of a small neighborhood center with some commercials surrounded by some housing density to help frame it. The other thing to note here, again, in the notion of just doing these a little differently scheme to scheme, is we're using a little bit, we're spreading out a little bit. We're pushing our elbow room out just a little bit here. So the fingers here are a little wider than in the other scheme. So we're kind of sliding down the hill a little bit. Kim mentioned that notion of low impact development, but we're using a little bit more of the land. So the sort of 3 fingers are wider than the other schemes, but we're trying to do the parts where it widens out using single family land use. So again, we can avoid some of that mass grading motion. So the unit count here jumps up a little bit. We're now at about maybe 350 units, something like that. Again, all very loosey-goosey at this point, but a little more spread out. And something to mention in this one, I'm sorry, just one last thing to mention on these, with the fingers here, the 3 fingers all have sort of a neighborhood green space at the end at those sort of promontory points, just like some of the other schemes. All right, now I'll flip ahead. So now we're starting to build up an intensity. So concept C is really about taking that same idea from concept B, but oomping it up a little bit. So we're trying to ratchet up the housing count a little more. We're trying to ratchet up the sort of commercial and retail that could go with that. And now we're starting to fold in some more of those apartments. So again, this is very residentially focused, but it's a little less neighborhoody and a little more villagey, if you want to think of it that way. You can go to the next one. So some pictures, you see that sort of picture on the bottom is a little bit more like a main street. You see the sort of upper right, which are sort of, now you're getting into some height and more apartment feel, less house feel, and getting a little bit of, maybe even some vertical mixed use like you see on the upper left. So it's starting to bump up a little bit in scale and intensity. Same idea here. So here you see because the intensity is bumping up, the access becomes a little more important. So again, we're working that connection on the southwest side there from an access standpoint. The focus here is really creating almost like a little mini town center where that sort of dark red is. So you have sort of that Main Street feel like you saw in that picture in the center. It's sort of the heart of the neighborhood. We still have the fingers. We're still pushing out a little bit in terms of elbow room, but you now see sort of on the upper west side, more apartment pads. So the previous scheme didn't have apartments in it. So we've the unit count is starting to creep up here a little bit. We're now in the maybe 450, 500 units total for this scheme, which allows us to get maybe a little bit more commercial space that's supported by more rooftops. Go to the next one. So this is concept D is now pushing the outside edge of this and really going to town. So if you think of concept A as sort of the neighborhoody thing, and I'm sorry, concept B is sort of the neighborhoody thing, the concept C is sort of the villagey thing. This is really like a town center kind of deal. So you're increasing the density, you're increasing the destination aspect of it, and you're, in this case, we're moving away from sort of small scale standalone retail into much more of that sort of integrated mixed use kind of retail like you would see in a town center. You can go to the next one. So some pictures here, you see, for instance, on the upper right, we're starting to get up in scale. We're starting to get more mixed use feeling. You see on the lower left, a much bigger kind of town green aspect as a central destination point. And some of those kind of things that come with it. You can go to the next. So here you see that blue star sort of in the middle of the site. That's really that big town green feel with mixed use all the way around it. You see a lot more brown and orange in this scheme. So again, the density is real. This is really about if we tried to push the boundaries of just slamming in a bunch of units. So we've gone away from any of the yellow single family stuff. There's still some missing middle, but not as much. And you see a lot of bigger apartment pads. Same idea with the promontories and the fingers and the open spaces, but really pushing the density. So here you might get up to anywhere from 900 to 1,000 units, something like that. Again, depending on how tall and how dense you make these multifamily units. But this one's really sort of pushing that density thing and really focusing on that center town green. The last one is something different altogether. So the last one is more like the first one in that you have the first one with sort of that recreation, open space, regional tourist destination almost, and a little bit of housing going with it. This one is sort of the same. It doesn't focus nearly as much on housing. This one has the least amount of housing of all the schemes, but it really pushes the economic development job creation. So in all of these, we've tried to take a real rough stab at how many jobs are created, and this one creates the most jobs of all the schemes by far. So this is really about thinking of it more about industry with some housing that goes with it, and a little bit of associated retail, that you could capture based on those user groups, but not a lot. If you go to the next one. So again, sort of some missing middle housing, but the industry piece starts to get a little more prominent here, that sort of flex industrial, light industrial, specialized industrial, whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot of different kinds of uses that could go there. We're not thinking of giant, huge buildings, I think, that would require mass grading and semi trucks and big things like that. It's a little smaller scale than that, but still a focus on sort of maker spaces and some of those kinds of things that can generate some economic development. So here's that scheme. It's a little more, this creates a little more enclaved pods, maybe I would say, than the other ones do. So a little less of a one big neighborhood kind of place and a little more of a series of pads. So you see the fingers that come out to the river, the two fingers closest to the river, we've still designated, again, they're fairly thin, so they're probably not good sites for industry, even small scale. We kind of think we want to favor housing for those in any of these schemes. So they all, we think those are great spots for housing. So we've kept that here. We've got a little commercial core like we do in some of the others, but then we've got these lower density and bigger density industry pads that we could develop some jobs out of in the two colors of pink. The darker pink on the top, something we haven't mentioned yet, but something to be somewhat aware of, is there's a weird, interesting dynamic when you walk the site now. there's a ridge line over there on that side, somewhat near 26. It sort of parallels 26. And at some point when you're walking down that hill towards the interstate, you don't really hear the interstate. You kind of see it off in the distance, but you don't really hear it. And then there's a point at which you get down to a certain level, and all of a sudden the noise from the interstate comes flying in. You really, and I don't know if we've mapped exactly where that is, but there's a real point of which over 20 or 30 feet walking towards the interstate, it goes from super quiet in the middle of the forest to feeling like you're up against the interstate and hearing the trucks and the cars and all that. So in that regard, that's why in some of these schemes, we've put some of the more multifamily, or in this case, the denser industry stuff over on that side where you have some noise issues on the outside edge. So those are the 5 schemes. So if I can just quickly try to summarize all of them, here's some side by side. Again, A is focused on that sort of regional recreation destination based. So you see a relatively modest unit housing count, but a pretty decent retail commercial count, and therefore jobs. Concept B, C, and D are all similar in that they're more neighborhood mixed use, but going from lower in densities up to higher densities. So you see the unit counts start to rise as you go from B to C to D, and particularly they start to shift from the single family and missing middle to the multifamily. So there again, you see on concept D a really big multifamily count, and the retail commercial number goes up. And then concept D is really on that job creation. It's a little confusing on this chart, but that retail commercial number, that 12 to 15 on concept D, that's just like the shopping, restaurant, lunch place, retail. There's a whole economic development side of that doesn't show up on this chart, but the actual commercial square footage gets much bigger there. So those are the sort of fundamental differences. Oh, there's a separate chart. Thank you. Didn't realize you had the bottom of the chart in there. So there you go. So you can see the job creation number on the bottom. The affordable housing number, don't read too much into the pure counts, because and we'll talk about this later in one of our breakout sessions today, but affordable housing is really going to be a policy thing about how much affordable, Tim mentioned mixed income, and we're very big believers in mixed income. And so the question there becomes, what's the mix? And so this was just taking a rough stab at something. So the point is not the number of units, affordable units created here, or even at what level of affordability. This is more about comparing from scheme to scheme. So you see that economic development scheme in E has very few opportunities. A and B have, because they're so more focused on that single family, have some affordable housing opportunities. And then D, obviously, with that big focus on multifamily, has the biggest opportunity to do affordable housing. But those numbers could go significantly higher depending on the mix and the policy. So with that, that is my summary of all 5 schemes.
Thank you, Bob. Excellent summary. We do have time for a few questions, but before we open up for questions, we have done some initial feedback and engagement with the county commissioners. I'll let Tim Love talk to some of their initial sentiments about the site and what they really want to see.
Thanks, Kim, and I'll be brief. When we started off on this project, we were asked to do due diligence on the site. So look at what's possible. And so that's what we've done with these concepts. And you may be thinking to yourself, why do we need an employment hub, for instance, when Biltmore Park West is right across the river? And for us, we wanted to look at all options to make sure that we were doing appropriate due diligence. And so that's why you're seeing some of those options. Just a few other things I'd like to mention. Bob described the scenarios really well. And some of you may be looking at the commercial piece and saying, well, how the heck are we going to get people up into the site to, pick up their dry cleaning or whatever it is? And so I'd ask you to think a little more broadly when we think commercial. Think about a childcare center. Think about institutional uses as you look at that. Don't get caught up in fast food or whatever it is. But like Kim said, so before we came to y'all, we did solicit public input from the commission, and the thought process on that was, let's make sure the commission is interested in still proceeding with this project before we go and talk to a bunch of stakeholders, talk to the public, talk to the neighbors. And so that was our thought process. And so now we're here with you because commission has said that they're interested and want to learn more. So with that said, you know, the leanings of the commission, I think they tended to lean towards the middle. Some of the comments I heard were, let's make a dent in affordable housing in that crisis. Let's maximize density in the places that we are developing with the least amount of impact on the rest of the site. So I would say they're leaning in kind of that B, C range, but they want to hear from this group and understand kind of what your thoughts are. Y'all are experts in your fields, and so we want to hear your input, but that's what we've heard from them. That said, no decisions have been made. Our timeline for this project, we'll bring this phases 2 and 3 to a wrap in early 2022, let's say in the spring, summer timeframe. So lots of opportunities to still be engaged. We do plan on holding a stakeholder engagement session in the new year, but we're also going to be meeting with residents directly impacted by this site in the January timeframe. So a lot can happen between now and then, but just wanted to provide those few comments. Kim, anything I missed?
Yeah, I think just for y'all to understand further our scope of work. So Tim mentioned more public input in January, and then there'll be one more checkpoint of public input a little bit later in the year. After we get feedback from you as stakeholders in the public, we're going to hear about what the final result is of what the preferred scenarios, and we'll likely choose 2 different scenarios that are the most preferred and detailed them out further so that the resulting final deliverable will be something that the county can say, hey, public, this is what we're going after, and actually, you know, start talking to partners about how this gets done.